Planetarium laser light shows and planetarium laser projection equipment have formed part of the history of laser. And I am very excited because today I am being joined by what I think is one of the pioneers in the whole of the laser industry. And there's a handful of people who I can say are pioneers in the industry. And this gentleman is definitely one of those. So I'm very excited to be here today. And if you're not excited, pretend to be excited. I'm very excited to be here today with what I've heard is the Steven Spielberg of lasers. And I'm sure we will investigate that a little bit later. But ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to ArgonTV, Mr. Doug McCullough.
Hey, Tim, thanks.
Round of applause, Doug. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining me here at ArgonTV. And as I say, I'm very excited to be talking to you because I really feel that if it wasn't for people like yourself, I wouldn't be here in this industry and the industry wouldn't be what it is, because you really are one of the pioneers of laser, in my opinion. And I'm very grateful to all the things that you did in the beginning. But let's go back all the way to the beginning. What was it that inspired you to get into lasers, and how did you get into the industry, and how did you get started?
Okay. This goes back into the 1960s, okay? So I was born in 1951, and when I was, 10 to 14 years old, somehow I would end up being the person who was in charge of slide projectors and 16 millimeter movie projectors. It was like, here, give it to Doug. He knows how to run this. And so I was not really a great technical person. I don't consider myself an engineer, but for some reason, these things just came naturally to me. So fast forward to 1967, the summer of love, okay? And I grew up right outside of Washington, D.C., and we had a brand new venue. It was actually an old movie theater that was going to be called the Psychedelic Power and Light Company. But the local authorities, they wouldn't give a permit for such a name, a druggy kind of name. So it was just the Ambassador Theater. And they had hired all of these light show artists from San Francisco to come out there and set up this psychedelic light show. And so they had people like Jimi Hendrix perform there, and other bands like that during the day. And I came out to see this light show during the summer of love, okay? And as soon as I walked in, I was just mesmerized by these huge projections and how they completely transformed the environment. And having a little audiovisual background, I could look and say, oh, those are slide projectors with a color wheel in front. Oh, that's an overhead projector. Oh yeah, and look at that, they have liquids on an overhead projector. And here's a strobe light. And so I just understood from a technical standpoint how they had put this thing together. Okay. And around that time, I was interested in having a rock band, me and my buddies. So I was playing bass. I like jazz rock. But I wasn't a good musician. I wasn't serious about it. So for our high school homecoming dance, which was in the cafeteria, I got on this thing that was called the Hop Committee. All right, this is in high school, so that I could influence who would be selected to be the band for this and get somebody that was good, because usually they were cheesy. So we got this really good band, but we didn't have any money left. So everybody said, what are we going to do for decorations? And I said, well, if we can borrow overhead projectors and slide projectors and 16 millimeter from the science department, okay, the chemistry class, I can put together a psychedelic light show. And everybody said, what? You can? I said, yeah. So we did that. It was an enormous success. And immediately we got booked to do another show, and then another show, and another show. And so this psychedelic light show was born. It was called the Babylonian Pigpen Light Obligado. Okay? And so we started doing these psychedelic light shows all over DC with all of the top bands. And it was a huge, huge success. And I realized that everything that I wanted to express creatively with music, I could do visually with music, and I was talented at it. I don't think I would have had a great career as a professional musician, but I really had a knack for creating visuals. Of course, this was all live with music. And my interest just snowballed. And pretty soon it just became like an obsession with me, that all the time I was thinking about creating light shows. And, you know, when I would go into a department store, I would go over and I would look at shower curtains and think about how this would be if it were a rear projection screen. And then I would go in and I would look at chemicals and think of, you know, is this transparent, and how this would work out with a liquid on the overhead, and on and on and on and on. So I started to look at psychedelic light shows as an art form, and I studied it, and I found out that it was something that had been going on for centuries. You know, people had been thinking about and looking for a way to visualize music, going back to a Jesuit priest who invented this thing called the color organ. He was French, so it had a French name, which I can't quite remember. But it was Father Castile, and so he invented this thing with candles and filters. It was called the color organ. Well, it was only moderately interesting until the invention of the electric light bulb. And then this idea of what they called back in those days color music really started to blossom. And there was a Russian composer named Scriabin who composed a symphony that was to have a light score with it, okay? And then pretty soon there were these artists that started to develop color music, the greatest of which was a guy named Thomas Wilfred, who invented this thing, the art of light, which he called lumia, okay? And so Thomas Wilfred, back in the 1920s and 30s, was having these fantastic light shows with orchestras, okay? World War II comes along, the economy changes, nobody's interested in this art of light stuff. So it was pretty dormant, kind of an underground scene until the 1960s, when psychedelic light shows had this resurgence of interest, okay? Of course, it was much, much more frenetic and energetic than what was being done in lumia. But that's what got me going with this idea of visualizing music. So I looked at myself as an artist, okay? And I was doing something that was really a classical art form. It was something more than just a fad, but to me it was visualizing music. So I was very, very serious about it, very intense. I went to college for a year, and they weren't teaching anything remotely like this, okay? And we would have some fairly well-known people that would come, and you know, I would get talked into doing something, you know, for an event. I did something with avant-garde composer John Cage, and John Cage was so interesting because he met with me and he took a liking to me and said, he just looked at me and shook his head and said, "Nobody here understands what you're about. You need to get out of here as soon as possible." And much to my parents' dismay, I dropped out of college and set upon doing, you know, light shows. Okay, so this is like in 1969, 70. Well, as it turns out, that's when the whole psychedelic era faded and hard metal, rock and roll started to come in with Led Zeppelin and other groups that weren't interested in liquids and, you know, all this all the peace and love vibes, okay, that went along with light shows. But I persisted. Of course, I couldn't get a job anywhere. So I was basically a starving hippie working on my light show contraptions. And like I said, I wasn't really a technician, but what I would do is I would think about what it was that I wanted to create, and then I would learn whatever I needed to learn to do it. Learn how to wire, learn about motors, how to control the speed of motors, very precisely and in reverse directions. It was a big, big deal. DC motors, oh my God, what a revelation that was. And at the same time, lasers were just starting to be introduced in art, okay? So I went to the Smithsonian to see an exhibition that had some lasers in it. It might have been part of EAT, which was Experiments in Art and Technology. It was kind of a highbrow art thing, kind of world renowned. They would come in with some very famous artists and do certain setups for a World's Fair, or, big museums. But I wasn't really impressed with the laser end of it. I thought, it was just kind of like a squiggle moving around on a wall. And I thought, well, gee, I can do that a lot cheaper with an incandescent light. So why do I need to spend all this money for a laser? But around about 1970, I was involved in a concert with electronic composer Morton Subotnick. And Morton had a Metrologic helium neon laser. Must have been all of, it was no more than 25 milliwatts, I'm sure of that, at the most. And so I took that laser and I had two pieces of pebble plexiglass, and I put those on a horizontally rotating turntable and got that thing going slow and shot the red beam through it and had the plexiglass rotate around, and we got this beautiful interference pattern. So that was my first experience, about 1970, using a laser in a show. I was not that impressed, but I did it, okay, and Morton liked it. So all during the 70s, I kept working with my light show approach, but I would do it with classical music and jazz and all kinds of things. And we didn't have any lasers. And my small group of friends and people that knew me were very, very impressed, but I couldn't get any decent gigs anywhere. I couldn't make a living at it. If I told somebody I was a light artist, they thought I was a bullshit artist. Like, what's a light artist? What do you hang decorations at Christmas? I mean, what's a light artist, right? So around about 1976, maybe 77, I became aware of this thing called Laserium, which had just recently arrived in New York City. It had started in Los Angeles. And so they had it in New York City, and that was about a 6-hour drive for me. So I drove to New York City with my then girlfriend, who later became my wife. And we came to New York City to the Hayden Planetarium, and I saw Laserium, and I was just blown away, because here was a show that was selling out in the planetarium in New York City with people out the door and around the block. And they would come in and sit down and watch this nonverbal presentation of light and music, and loved it. And I was like, wow, this is it. This is like the temple of light. I felt like I had, been propelled into the future. Okay. And I was just so impressed with what they were doing. I mean, it made such a huge impression on me. And so I contacted Laser Images, the company that did it, to see, if they were hiring and everything. But they kind of just sort of poo-pooed me and, put me off. They were in California, and you know, if we're ever looking for somebody, we have your name on record and we'll give you a call. They never did, of course. But I was just so completely inspired by this, and it really, really gave me hope. And so around the same time, I started to take a hard look at myself from, let's say, a psychological standpoint, so that I wondered, if I was so smart and I was so talented and everybody thought my light show stuff was so great, okay, why wasn't I successful? So what I looked at was, what was between me and being successful was me. I had to change the way that I operated, okay? And what I had to look at was my stance as an artist, okay? So as an artist, I was, to a large extent, unconcerned with the audience reaction to what I created. To me, art was controversial, okay? Art was not pandering to their, to their taste, to the audience taste. It was to present something new, maybe something that was shocking, okay? I don't mean anything that was, risque or anything like that, but I mean like shocking to the senses, shocking, unexpected. One thing that I did, I remember, was we had a show, it was called Let There Be Light. And in the show, I had a sequence of electronic music that had the colors change as we move through these different energy centers. In Indian religion, they're called chakras. They're centers of light. And as you move up the spectrum, you move up in terms of a greater consciousness. And so when we got up to the highest consciousness of samadhi or enlightenment, the music stopped and we just went into pure light for a while. And the audience just didn't know how to respond. They thought, did the sound system break? What's going on here? And it was so funny to me to see the audience be crazy because they didn't know how to contextualize this. But to me, it was art. Well, what I started to realize was that if I wanted to have things work on a big level with all of this high technology, and especially as we got into expensive lasers, I had to become a businessman. I had to make things work as an entrepreneur. I had to make things work for my audience. So I understood the distinction between art, okay, and entertainment. Entertainment, in my understanding, was basically, in a sense, manipulating the audience, was catering to the audience preconceived notions, okay? So instead of playing John Coltrane, A Love Supreme, if I played Pink Floyd, people could accept it and get very, very excited and buy a lot of tickets to come see the Pink Floyd show, as opposed to nobody buying tickets to see the John Coltrane show. Now, it doesn't mean that there was any less artistry, and I'll call that craftsmanship, that went into the design and presentation itself. But what I started to do was change my focus to entertain people. And so all of my shows, the objective was to entertain and hold everyone's attention. And it was very, very interesting as I made the transition from light shows that accompanied live musicians to, let's say, a planetarium show where everybody came there and the star of the show were the visuals that you were doing. You weren't accompanying, you were the lead. And so the onus, the demand to entertain and hold people's attention was much, much greater. If you think about a psychedelic light show and you've got, Janis Joplin or Jimi Hendrix or somebody up there performing and the audience is going nuts and the liquids are going wild behind them, it's really cool. But if you take away Hendrix and you just play a recording and you look at the liquids, it doesn't hold your attention in the same way. So I really had to demand upon myself to be much, much more innovative and clever in terms of the rate at which I changed visuals within a given presentation. And it really was a fascinating learning experience. There's so many things with the development of a show, like a 50-minute planetarium show, that when it's successfully put together, meeting these demands is very, very interesting. What do you do at the beginning of a show to grab the audience's attention and satisfy them so that everybody knows, hey, I'm in the right stuff? And then to move on from there and to go into different moods so that you don't just start a show and plateau with the energy level and it's boring fast. That what you do is you take people through a lot of different emotional moods. As a matter of fact, when I'm doing a show, what I think of is, what do I want the audience to feel and experience at this point? And then working backwards from that, then I design the effects that are going to achieve that.
Wow.
So some people would ask me about putting together a show, and I say, well, it's kind of like a Shakespearean play, and they laugh at me and they think I'm full of it, but the idea is that you need to introduce different elements in the show and take people through a lot of different moods. And I always like to surprise people and have them experience something that they didn't expect to experience on the show. For one thing, comedy, okay? Have something really, really funny, that you don't expect in the middle of a show. I'll give you an example. Way back in the day, in the 1970s, one of our great points in the middle of a planetarium show, we could be doing a show with multiple groups, Alan Parsons and Pink Floyd and, all different bands that would have suitable music. And then right in the middle of it, after a song, we would do dueling banjos. Okay, dueling banjos, do you know it?
All right. I don't know, no.
Oh, well, it's a banjo piece, a real bluegrass country piece that was popular with the movie Deliverance way back in the early 70s. And everybody would clap along with this thing. Okay, and they would laugh because you'd have a little abstract laser image and another one, and they became, anthropomorphic, where, they would start to interact with each other and then chase each other around. Then suddenly they're fighting and pounding the heck out of each other, with the two instruments, dueling banjos, the dueling laser patterns. So that was just an early primitive example where we would take something that you didn't expect and have the audience participate, clapping, and do something that was funny, okay? And another thing that was very, very, it took me a while to learn was how to end the show. It seems simple, but, it took me a couple years to really, really understand how it was that I would set up the end and then boom, delivered. It was just like a knockout punch, okay? And you needed to do it 3 numbers before, 3 songs before, okay? So, very interesting. Just making me think of the importance of music. Music was my original inspiration. And I think that people, of course, understand, lasers and music, they go together. But the importance of music is just incredible. For instance, the music is what creates the, what I would call the emotional context for everything that happens. You have the music that's moving you emotionally, and then the lasers, the visuals, deliver the punch. The lasers have to deliver, but if the music's not right for your particular audience, it's not going to work.
You actually made a comment that I was going to talk about, and I think this is an appropriate time to talk about this. And I can't remember if I read it or if someone told me that you'd said this, but the comment is, are you seeing it or are you hearing it?
Yeah. Yes, well, that's the goal. You see, the goal is that everything is so well synchronized and expressed, okay, that, like we say, you don't know what it is. It's there. And if a show is well designed, a person doesn't have to have any background, artistic background or anything. They're just moved. It's just like boom, 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 boom. The drums are happening, it builds. The color modulation, the harmonics are there. You don't have to know anything about art. It's beautiful. It's like, you look at an animated rainbow. I mean, wow, right? It's just fantastic.
And you're an interviewer's dream, because I hardly need to say anything. I can just let you talk for hours. And I think we could probably, do 5 or 6 hours of this. But wow, I mean, some of the stuff you've been talking about so far is literally mind-blowing. The people you've met in the beginning, how you got started, the people you met, and the inquisitiveness of your mind, of how you look at things and say, how does this work? How can I apply this? What can I do with this? What can I?
Oh, yeah.
And you said something earlier that I really resonated, was that when you saw the show, you just felt like, wow, this is like something I've never seen before. And it was the same for me. The first time I saw Laser, I was 28, so totally different background to you. I was pretty much a failed high school dropout because I just didn't fit in. My mind worked in a totally different way to everyone else. And it's not that I wasn't smart. I'm a very smart guy. I just didn't understand or see why I should do all these stupid exams when I could be doing things. So I left school at 16, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I drifted through all different things, but I was entrepreneurial. I hardly ever worked for anyone else unless I absolutely had to. And then one day, I had this bright idea of buying my own nightclub. I thought I'd be Don Tim, and have all the trimmings that go with that. And I did. I bought this nightclub with a partner of mine. I was 28. I had no idea what I bought, no idea what I was doing. And then we took the place over, and my DJ said to me, we have a laser here. And I said, what's a laser? And he said, oh, sit down and watch this. It will blow your mind. And it did. He turned this 100 milliwatt Argon laser on, and my whole life changed. In an instant, my mouth fell open, my eyes popped out, the cartoon style. My heart was going like this. And I was like, wow. Yep. And I didn't know anyone who had a laser. So I knew I had something really special. And this was 1998. And I was kind of in the same position with you. When you first saw it, it was just breathtaking.
Yes.
It made me want to do it. I said, this is it. This is my place. I found my home in life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And since then, that's what I've done.
Yeah.
And it changed my life. So, and it's the same, I look at things and I go, what if I put this in my show? I remember I had a 500 milliwatt laser one time. We were doing a show for the Canadian Embassy in Manila, and they wanted the Burrada Oralis effect.
Sure.
So I got a glass of water.
Yeah.
I put some hair gel on the outside. We put it in front of the laser, and we just turned it, and we had this beautiful effect on the wall. And they were like, we like that. And you make so many comments. I mean, wow, what an intro. What a beginning to a discussion about lasers. How fascinating it would have been. I mean, I would have loved to be part of those early days. How fascinating it would be to involved in all those people, to meet, Hendrix and all those guys, and be involved in the early days, and just your absolute persistence of not giving up. And then the mind shift that you went through, where you realized it's not about you. It's about, no one cares about me when they come to see a show. It's all about what's in it for me.
Yep.
your mind shift of how you shifted from what you wanted to what the audience wants, I think is really fascinating. And I was actually talking to someone about a totally different subject, about Facebook. Why does no one respond to any of my Facebook posts? And they said, because you make it all about you and no one gives a crap. So I started shifting my whole Facebook group. My profile now is all about lasers and other people and you and Bill Bennett and Tim Walsh and Roberta McHatton and all these other people. And all of a sudden my Facebook exploded.
Yes.
You know, and I'm posting interviews like this, which is not about me, it's about you.
Yes.
So, and, you know, and it's for an audience who are interested in your story. And it's what a fascinating story you've had. It's really incredible for me to be talking to you, because, as I said earlier, without you, there would be no me. So, you know, and Tim Walsh made this comment as well the other day. I interviewed him, and he said in the early days, like the 70s and the 80s, when the lasers started becoming popular, a laser was $75,000, $100,000. So a client could only afford one or maybe two lasers for a show.
Right.
And we had to be very creative to make those two little beams look fantastic. Now, well, they just stick 100 lasers in and it looks brilliant, you know?
And, and the technical requirements with the water and the power, you know, for that one laser were so extreme, and how huge the laser was.
Incredible, incredible. Well, I'm very happy. Well, let's just take a quick break. I'm really happy to be talking to you. And in a moment, we're going to get back and talk about the Planetarium Laser Light show a little bit more.
Sure.
And I've got some questions I want to ask you about that. But I'm so excited because right now I'm talking to Doug McCullough, who's from Laser Show Design. And we're talking about Planetarium Laser Light shows. And we'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to ArgonTV. I'm really excited, and we've been having this enthralling discussion with Doug McCullough from Laser Show Design, and he's been talking about how he got started in lasers and the Planetarium Laser Light shows and all the beginning, the history of laser, as I call it. So very excited. So great to have you here, Doug. And I wanted to, and I'm going to have to read from this because this is a quotation that I found about you. It said, "Lasers are not just another gee-whiz special effect, but a powerful tool to communicate ideas." I believe you said that, yes?
Yep.
And I find this really interesting that you can use these beams of light to tell stories. And I just wanted to ask you if you could share some thoughts about the whole storytelling aspect of the lasers and the planetariums and how it all works.
Yeah. Well, I was talking earlier about going to see a Laserium show. And I was so inspired that it just, really made me want to get involved with lasers. I have to tell you, at first I was very resentful of lasers because I felt like, why do I need this expensive equipment? I can do all these similar things with incandescent lights, abstract imagery, multimedia we were doing. But I was persuaded by my then girlfriend, who became my wife, Joanne, that what we really needed to do to be successful was incorporate lasers. So we did. And what we did initially was very, very primitive. It was all abstract, abstract imagery like Laserium, with some effects to create what they then called Lumia. So it was abstract amorphous effects and cycloids, basically. But we started to, we wanted to do more with the laser. And I started to see that the laser was kind of the realization of the color organ from hundreds of years before. that here was this one really unique light source that you could do so much with to visualize music. Well, there had been a show called Love Light back in Boston before I was working with high power lasers. It was around 1976, 77. And what they had done at Love Light was they had used a graphic tablet to digitize vector images and have graphics projected in laser, something that Laserium could not do. Well, that was really, really fascinating to me because I had always loved animated cartoons, you know, back from the 1930s, okay, and early Porky Pig and Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, all the stuff, the early stuff I just thought was so outrageous and so funny, and the animation was so wild, surreal. And so we found this Defense Department engineer who was working with a computer at his home, and he claimed that he could, you know, create vector images with the laser. And so we started working with this guy on the side. We're talking about 1979. So this was this was right in the beginning of you know, laser graphics. And there was actually a company that kind of was an outgrowth of Love Light. They were called Laser Displays in Boston, and they were doing it, but not really animation. They would take a graphic and then they would put it into a rotator and kind of rotate it around, and it was a two-dimensional image, but you know, that was pretty cool back then. You know, if you could do more than one graphic in a laser show, this was like, wow, big time. So anyway, so we started working on this, and we developed laser animation, where we could load in 24 images and we could do frames. We could have a little character that could run, and we could do a character that would stop running, and then it would do a metamorphic transform to another image. And then, you know, all kinds of little, you know, little animation tricks that we could do. So in 1980, we had our first laser show with graphics. So going back to this idea of telling a story, now things really, really opened up. And I had a creative orientation towards the shows where even before we had the graphic capability, I would put together a show that might tell a story. For instance, our first planetarium show was called Laser Drive. And what it was a kind of trip through outer space, okay? So that we had a voice come on. It was a female voice that was supposed to be the onboard computer. And so this voice would say, we're preparing for liftoff, and you do this shtick. And so we'd go into liftoff, and then we'd be out in space and we'd have a song. And then after that song, the computer voice would come back in and introduce what we were going to do next. Oh, we're approaching a black hole. We did Pink Floyd. One of these days was our journey through the black hole. But the point is that we were able to, with the soundtrack, create a storyline as the context for the whole show. And as we added in the graphics capability, now it just really, really opened up. So we were able to do some very, very unusual and experimental things. For example, there was a Japanese poem that I really, really liked. And so I hired an actor, you know, in Washington, D.C. at the Arena Stage, you know, Shakespearean, to do the voiceover for this translation of this Japanese poem, okay, about the flower petal. It was a love story, okay, like a myth. And so he would do this thing, and we would have the very simple laser graphics doing beautiful, poetic, artistic transformations and simple little things with this poem that we did in the middle of a laser show. And that was one of the shows that we would do for a matinee audience, you know, not the late night, you know, Zeppelin or Pink Floyd show, but the title of that show was Visual Music, was the title for that show. And nobody seemed to understand visual music, so we changed it to Laser Tunes, which seemed to, you know, be more understandable to matinee audiences. But the idea was to use the lasers in such a way as to tell a story, which I still do today. I'm still doing shows, and somebody described our show as a series of stories, that every song is like its own little vignette, its own little story. Okay, you know, it may have animated characters in there. You know, sometimes things can be rather obvious. You know, if you have a funny little country and western song, you know, and you have your, you know, your hillbilly characters in there, and, you know, they might be out fishing and, you know, do all kinds of antics, and that's just part of the song. You know, it's all pretty much indicated by the lyrics. Okay.
I think
but,
just to jump in, I think this is something that actually made groups like Pink Floyd and Janis so interesting in the time that they were big, because their songs were stories. In fact, some of their whole LPs, as we used to call them in the old days, it wasn't like 10 separate stories. It was one continual story going all the way through. That you could get attached to, and you know.
Well, again, going back to the whole planetarium idea. So we did our first planetarium show in Miami in 1979. And we just had great success, okay? Laserium was the big company. This was sort of like David and Goliath, okay? They had 25, you know, shows worldwide, and they were in all the major markets, and we just managed to get into Miami because the director somehow didn't like Laserium, okay? So he wanted to do something different. So he brought us in, and we just had tremendous success. And so then we went to all the smaller planetariums that weren't big enough for Laserium. And then finally we got to the point where up in Canada, in Calgary and Winnipeg, the directors there said, yeah, we have Laserium come in the summer, but we want to give you guys a shot. So we came in, and we had much greater success than Laserium. And then from there, we got into Boston. We had greater success than Laserium. And so we were building up. And then finally, in 1973, we knocked Laserium out of the Hayden Planetarium in New York City.
Wow.
And up until that time, all of our shows were featured a variety of musical groups. Okay, it wasn't just one group. But when we went to New York, we said, okay, we're going to do all Pink Floyd. So we did. Laser Floyd. That was our show. And it was a mix of all different Pink Floyd music. It wasn't just one album, okay? It was a mix, Laser Floyd. Huge success, better than Laserium. Better than Laserium. And so the thing that we were able to do really for the first time was exploit the graphic elements and the abstracts simultaneously and where they would interact. So for instance, you know, in Another Brick in the Wall leading into it, you know, there's the sound of the helicopter, right? And the guy's yelling, you know, hey, you know? And so we would have this sound, we would have like a helicopter, and we'd have the blades up above in the planetarium and going around with the lights. And then we'd have this little character running. We called him the guy in the leotard, but he looked like a character from the Blue Man Group. This is way before the Blue Man Group. But we sort of developed this look for the Pink Floyd shows. And so we had this guy running, and he would reappear all during the show in different situations. You know, he'd come back uncomfortably numb, and he'd come back during brain damage, and, you know, he would show up from time to time. But he was this really, it was just like a Blue Man Group guy, very amorphous. As a matter of fact, Pink Floyd would use a similar character in some of their music videos. But we would have this helicopter thing, and then the guy would be running, and then we'd have an abstract, boom, that would come out of the helicopter and come down and come huge in the dome, like right down on you. And when it would come down, boom, it would knock the the little animated guy down on his face, and he'd jump back up and start running again. So very, very simple. But what it was the interaction of the abstracts, okay, with the graphics. And so this was something that we really, really exploited in our planetarium shows, okay? And, you know, we went on from Pink Floyd. The big challenge was, what are you going to do after Pink Floyd? Okay, we tried a show that was multi-group, and it was only moderately successful. So we felt like, well, we've got to come back with a single group, Led Zeppelin. So we did Laser Zeppelin, and that was almost equal to Pink Floyd. Although I will say that the sound of the audience was louder than Pink Floyd. The way that the Zeppelin audiences would scream and yell, it was unbelievable. So we did a whole series of shows that originated in the planetarium in New York City, the Hayden Planetarium, and then other, you know, laser companies would see what we were doing, and then, you know, you'd see Laserium copy us. We were now basically creatively leading the way, so that we would do a Pink Floyd show, then they would follow with a Pink Floyd show in LA. Zeppelin, like that. It was kind of funny to see that reversal.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you're talking about some really interesting points, and sometimes I get comments saying, you know, we want to know the how-tos more than the histories and the emotions behind it. But I feel that as I have these discussions with people like yourself, the real secrets are in the conversation that we're having right now, the passion, the feelings,
yes,
you know, even the fact that you looked somewhere else that where
yeah.
your big competitor wasn't.
Oh yeah.
That was something I did because I'm based in Manila now. And that was one of the things that we did. Like, Manila has become this cutthroat red ocean where all the companies are fighting for the shows. So we went to the provinces.
Yeah, you a little bit about this. I feel that laser shows are what I would call a referential art, meaning, or art form, meaning that very, very little of it is original, that what it is taking other imagery, other ideas that are in the culture visually, and then incorporating it into your presentation. So, for instance, I would always be looking for inspiration. Movies, television commercials, fantastic. Some stupid commercial on television for some, you know, stupid little Christmas thing or a car dealership. And I look at that and go, wow, that one idea right there, the way that thing came out three-dimensionally, that's a great idea. I'm going to use that. And so the thing is that you need to be learning. You need to be visually open, okay? And there's not really a how-to, you know, like a manual, like, okay, do this. No, it doesn't really exist, because it's you know, you can study something, you can learn about writing. If you can express yourself writing and you're able to translate that visually, okay, that's it. That's the leap. You know, whatever you're looking at. You know, a lot of times we'll be working on a piece and, you know, we'll have like 80% of it done, and then there's a section here, and we just all might brainstorm about it. You know, if I'm working with an animator, and we might just sit around for an hour and talk about cartoons and tell some jokes and, you know, and come up with some kind of idea about, well, what if we do this here, you know, and we start to work on it. And if you have a really, really good animation artist, and I've been incredibly fortunate to work with many, the key is to come up with a good drawing. Okay, going back again to laser shows, a lot of the laser shows have bad drawings. They just look terrible, okay? With me, it's not a question of you've got to have a zillion frames of animation. Just give me one really good, beautiful frame that's evocative, okay? one beautiful picture of a woman's face. It doesn't have to be too detailed. As a matter of fact, the less detail that you have, the more that's left up to the imagination. Okay? Going back again to, what is it that I want somebody to feel? What do I want them to think during this piece? And then design it from that backwards. That's the way to go, in my opinion. That's the way to succeed.
How interesting. And you made a really good comment just now about watching the adverts as a source of inspiration or a source of information, because you know how much money they spend on getting these adverts correct and how much market research they do. And if you watch those and incorporate their techniques into what you're doing, you should have a really good project. And one of the things I've always been grateful for in this industry is, like, I've done so many conferences, it's crazy. And I sit at the back of the room listening to information that people pay for in the audience. I get it all for free, and I'm being paid. I get it all for free. And I'm working with some of these big companies, the telecommunication companies and the big giants in food. And they're sharing all their strategic plans and all their ideas with the audience. And I'm sat at the back of the room making all my notes, listening to them. So there's this whole world of information that's right in front of us. And if we look at it, we get some great answers. But I also think it's so interesting to hear your story of animation, because, you know, we live in a world now, it's so digital and everything's just so easily, readily available for us.
Right.
In those days, there was literally nothing. You had to create it. And I think it's just, what a fascinating time to be living in and to watch that roll out.
What impresses me when I look at other people's shows is not necessarily like how many lasers and how many scanners and how sophisticated it is. That's important. But that's not maybe what impresses me most. It's what somebody does with what they have. They can have something very simple, but the way that they use it, and I'll give you an example. Recently, there was somebody, and I can't remember his full name, but I believe his first name was Adam, and he took a Microsoft logo design and rear projected it through a black scrim. How simple, and how effective it was. I was absolutely blown away with what an incredible application that was of lasers. Again, going back to the idea of not just a G with special effect, but a tool to communicate. I'll give you another example. One time I was working on a corporate presentation where they wanted to put over the idea, this was in the late 80s, and they wanted to put over the idea that your telephone system wasn't just a telephone, it was it could be internet, and it could be used for document creation and all these different things. And so what they did was they created all these television monitors with all of the different uses, and then we had a laser that was positioned up high, and with sound effects, the cheesy sound effect, we'd have a beam that would shoot over, it would hit the monitor, and the monitor would glow argon, the same color, it'd have a burst glow, and then it would resolve into what the device was that was being linked up, via this communication system. And so again, all it is a laser beam, but we're using it to show connectivity in three-dimensional space, And of course, to introduce this new corporate idea, it was a big hit. Once they did it once, it was like, okay, now they sent us on the road and we had to do it everywhere. Every time they were, doing a presentation, we'd have to do the whole laser setup for it. Kind of cool. That was back in the late 80s.
Yeah, and the power of the story is fascinating. And I'm going to talk to the audience now. I bet you are absolutely enthralled at what you're hearing so far. And you probably don't realize that we have been talking for almost an hour and 5 minutes about this.
I don't.
You didn't. I just looked at the clock and I go, this is how powerful a story can be, is that I could talk to you for another 3 or 4 hours, which obviously we can't do. But I'm absolutely enthralled with this. And I had no idea that we've been going for 1 hour. That's the power of the story. And if you get it right, your audience will be absolutely captivated too. So I'm really grateful for you sharing these ideas. We're going to take another little break. I'm so excited. I'm so enthralled. I'm so impressed. I'm talking to Doug McCullough about not just planetarium laser light shows, but the whole history of laser and even the mind shift and the mindset of how to do lasers and how to tell stories and everything. Fascinating. We'll be back in just a moment. So welcome back. We have been having the most exciting conversation I've had recently about lasers, the history of lasers and planetarium light shows with Doug. And it's absolutely enthralling. And I thought what we'll do now, Doug, is maybe, you know, we've talked about the past and the history of laser for so long. Let's come up to date a little bit and tell us about your company, which is Laser Show Design, and what you're doing now and how people can get in touch with you.
Okay. Well, I am doing theme park shows now. Okay. The planetarium laser show market, unfortunately, has sort of dried up. Okay. But fortunately, I've been able to do nightly shows for Six Flags theme park. The one that I'm currently doing them, well, actually, I shouldn't say currently, because due to the pandemic, all outdoor shows like that in the US have been canceled. Okay. So it's been canceled for the summer. But up until the middle of March, we were avidly in the middle of producing a show for Six Flags Darien Lake. And those would be a 24-minute show approximately that incorporates full color lasers projected onto a huge screen. It would be 40 by 60 feet. All right. And then we have fireworks. We have 3 lasers set up to do overhead mid-air beam effects. We have 14 fog machines that we remotely control to shoot out the fog depending on which way the wind is blowing. We have some theatrical lighting that we use during the show, moving lights, mostly as audience blinders or to illuminate the audience. We have a pool in front that has a water screen, so occasionally we do rear projection on the water screen. We've got propane cannons. I said fireworks. Really, we have all kinds of layers of fireworks, you know, from close up out in front of the screen to right behind the screen. The screen, by the way, is a mesh so that it actually kind of turns transparent at night, and you can see the fireworks clearly right through the screen. So we get this incredible 3D layering that goes on. And so I do 24-minute shows, and those happen every night. You know, after the rides close, the park audience, usually about 80% of who's ever in the park, comes out to the side of the lake there and sits on the grass and watches the laser fireworks show.
That's beautiful.
So that's
beautiful. You know, I absolutely love these kind of shows. Back in 1992, which was why I actually started in laser for this specific project. I was actually taken to Expo 92 in Sevilla, in Spain. And we had 6 water screens in a 360-degree circle. And we had a bunker in the middle. And it was a huge event. You know, as you say, everyone in the park comes and watches the show. And it's the final part of the day. I absolutely love these shows. So if you ever need anyone to carry a coffee, just call me and you know, get me a visa to get into America. I'll be over there. So I love these kind of big shows. You know, fascinating and beautiful, beautiful way to share your talent. That's great. And you know, I think, you know, with what's happening in the world right now, we are in a crazy position. But you know, the show must go on. And, you know, in the not too distant future, we will be doing shows again. And I can't wait, because I think when we all get back to shows, it's going to be one hell of a party.
I agree. Well, that's what the park tells me. They say, we can't wait to get you back here. It's going to be a big part of our reopening. And, you know, the whole communal experience that you have at that type of show is really fantastic. I mean, of course, you get that sort of thing at a rave as well. You know, it's just so, well, it's so communal, so exciting.
Wow is the word I use. I love watching the audiences because, you know, after you do a show 4 or 5 times, you know where the audience reacts and when they go, whoa, and you can wait for it. And, you know, it's, as I say, I totally get where you're coming from with this, and I can't wait. I'd love to see some of your shows. So, you know, look forward to it all opening again. Now, Laser Show Design, how do people get in touch with you as a company? What's the best way?
Well, probably they could do an email or get in touch with me through the website. It's just lasershowdesign.com. Doug at lasershowdesign.com, you know,
awesome.
Is the email for that. So they can get in touch with me that way. I do occasional corporate shows and special projects. And sometimes I'm hired as a consultant for other people's show, you know, to do creative work. So I actually have done a bit of that the past year.
Brilliant. And, you know, I wanted to also talk about, and we don't really have the time because I think we'll be another 3 or 4 hours talking about this, but I really wanted to talk about all the awards and the achievements that you had. And you are multi-awarded, you know, a multi-awarded talent in your life. You've created so much, like the 360-degree, was it Omi scan for the planetariums?
Yep.
And there's so much history. I think we're going to have to come back and meet you again sometime. And I hope you will come back to ArgonTV again in the future and you know, share more of your stories.
We'd love to.
But I want to thank you so much for being part of ArgonTV, sharing your knowledge, sharing your stories and your insights and how you look at things. It's been an absolute wild ride for me, and I really appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. So I've been talking to the one and only, the very unique Doug McCullough from Laser Show Design. We've been talking about the history of laser, planetarium light, laser light shows, and mindset and everything else. And I look forward to seeing you all again at a future episode in ArgonTV.